During the dark winter nights of January 1762, London was flung into a state of frenzy by the news that the vengeful spirit of a murdered woman was making night hideous for the residents of a house in Cock Lane, a nondescript thoroughfare located on the western fringe of the City of London, by demanding that her killer be brought to justice and hanged for his crime. It wasn't long before anybody who was anybody, not to mention a fair smattering of nobodies who were nobody, had descended on Cock Lane to jostle, kick, shove, push, and generally steamroller their way into the haunted house, where, for a modest admission fee, they could listen for the ghost whose favoured means of communicating was to knock and scratch from sundry locations around the haunted room. As journalist Charles Mackay put it in his book Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, first published in 1841, the Cock Lane ghost kept London in commotion for a considerable time, and was the theme of conversation among the learned and the illiterate, and in every circle, from that of the prince to that of the peasant. News of the ghostly goings-on had soon spread far and wide, and the events surrounding the unquiet entity's nocturnal antics so permeated the national consciousness that they would be spoken of in hushed tones long after the players in the spectral drama had exited the stage and had shuffled off this mortal coil. Indeed, so enduring did the memory of the Cock Lane ghost prove that it would even be mentioned by Charles Dickens in the opening paragraphs of A Tale of Two Cities, written 97 years after the far-famed phantom had rapped out its final message from the great beyond. This is the story of a few weeks in 1762 when Londoners went ghost crazy and flocked in their thousands to a ramshackle abode in the Smithfield quarter of London in the hope of hearing scratching Fanny denounce her lover as her killer. I've been visiting Cock Lane on my London ghost walk for over 40 years, and I must admit that it is a location that always raises a titter from participants on the tour. Those titters often give way to outright guffaws when I explain that this mundane-looking thoroughfare is so named because in the Middle Ages it was one of London's legalised red-light districts. To be honest, there isn't a great deal to attract the curious wayfarer to this canyon-like side street that follows the downward slope of the eastern bank of the valley of the River Fleet. In fact, enraged revenants aside, there are only two things worth coming here to see. At the lane's western end you will find this splendid facade, the former London premises of Manchester inventor and engineer John Royal, whose creations included the self-pouring teapot, an ingenious labour-saving device that used air pressure to force the hot water through the tea leaves and out of the curved spout without the pourer having to go to the tedious trouble of lifting and tilting the pot. The Royal self-pouring teapot was hugely popular, and even Queen Victoria was the proud owner of one, although it is a moot point as to how much labour it actually saved her, as I would imagine that pouring her own tea was not something the widow of Windsor ever really troubled herself with, as she probably had another labour-saving device called a servant to perform that particular irksome task for her. At the lane's eastern end, high up on the wall of the building on the north side, the Golden Boy of Pie Corner looks out over the heads of passers-by below, marking the spot where the Great Fire of London burnt itself out in this section of the city in September 1666. Aside from these two attractions, however, there is little else to make a stroll along Cock Lane a worthwhile pursuit, although I will concede that traversing its time-worn sets in the closing light of day can be a decidedly eerie experience, which, given it is a ghost story that has brought us here, is chillingly apt. So let's travel back in time to the year of grace 1759, when the tenant of number 20 was one Richard Parsons, who lived here with his wife and two daughters, the eldest of which, Elizabeth, was about 10 years old when our story begins. Parsons was the officiating clerk at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre without Newgate, located between the back of the houses on the south side of Cock Lane and Newgate Street. This is Cock Lane's western end today. You can see the Tower of St. Sepulchre's looming over the building work that is currently taking place around it in 2026. And this is that same view as it would have appeared in the 18th century. The vicar of St. Sepulchre's at the time of the haunting was Thomas Pickering. But the clergyman who would become most associated with our ghostly tale was John Moore, assistant preacher at the church between 1754 and 1761, a devout, some might even say fanatical Methodist who, like many Methodists of the age, was a fervent believer in the supernatural. Although Richard Parsons' position as chief parish clerk afforded him a veneer of respectability, he did in fact have a reputation in the locality as a very drunken and highly insolent fellow. But he performed his duties efficiently, so the fact that he liked to while away his off-duty hours imbibing at his favourite hostelry, the Wheatsheaf on Cock Lane, was largely overlooked by his superiors. One Sunday morning, in October 1759, as Parsons was making the preparations for the service at St. Sepulchre's, he noticed a genteel-looking couple standing in the aisle, and approaching them, he obligingly showed them to a pew. After the service, the couple came over to thank Parsons for his civility and introduced themselves as Mr. and Mrs. William Kent, and inquired if he knew of anyone in the parish who might have lodgings that they might rent. Parsons informed them that, as it happened, he himself had a spare room at his own house in nearby Cock Lane, and if they wished, he would gladly take them there immediately so they could see if they considered it suitable. Mr. and Mrs. Kent replied that they would very much like that, and the trio therefore made their way to Parsons' house, where, on viewing the room, the couple pronounced it more than adequate for their modest needs, and thus the rent was agreed, and William and Fanny made the necessary arrangements to move in. However, all was not as it seemed with the couple, for Mr. and Mrs. Kent were harbouring a dark secret. In 1756, William Kent had married Elizabeth Lynes, the daughter of a prosperous grocer of Lynham in Norfolk. 11 months after their marriage, they moved to the village of Stoke, now known as Stoke Ferry, where William Kent took over the inn and also ran the post office. According to Kent's later account, the couple had lived in great love, harmony and friendship, and it wasn't long before Elizabeth was able to inform her devoted husband that she was expecting their first child. To assist her through her pregnancy, it was decided that Elizabeth's younger sister, Frances, or Fanny as she was always known to the family, would take up residence with the couple. For a time, domestic harmony reigned supreme in the Kent household. But tragedy struck when Elizabeth died giving birth to the child, a boy. Miss Fanny agreed to stay on to look after the baby, and when a month later the child followed his mother to the grave, she remained to console her distraught brother-in-law and to keep house for him. It was said by her family that Miss Fanny bore an uncanny resemblance to her late sister, so it might have been because of this that William Kent fell in love with his dead wife's sister, and when he found that she had likewise developed feelings for him, he proposed marriage to her, and she accepted. There was, however, a problem. Fanny's family objected strongly to the union and pointed out that a man was forbidden from marrying his dead wife's sister, as church law decreed that such an action was tantamount to incest. William Kent, though, was nothing if not determined, and so he travelled to London to consult an attorney about the matter. The lawyer, however, gave it as his opinion that such a marriage would indeed be unlawful. Had Elizabeth died without having given birth, he explained, had she died as a result of a miscarriage, or had the child even been stillborn, there would be no legal obstacle to William Kent marrying his sister-in-law. But the fact that the baby had been born and had lived for a month after his mother's death meant that in the eyes of the law, William Kent and Miss Fanny could never be married. It was with a heavy heart that William returned to Stoke Ferry to break this awful news to Fanny, and it was with profound sadness that he told her that he had decided it would be for the best if he were to sell his business interests in Norfolk, Miss Fanny were to return to live with her family in Lynham, and he would then move to London, where he intended to purchase a position in some public office, and this new start would, as he later put it, erase that passion he had unfortunately indulged. Thus it was that in January 1759, William Kent put the past behind him, packed his bags, and set off for London, where he settled in East Greenwich. Absence, they say, makes the heart grow fonder, and this certainly proved to be the case as far as Fanny was concerned. she began sending letters to William Kent, assuring him of her devotion, and expressing her determination that the two of them should spend their lives together, irrespective of what the law said. Eventually, William Kent succumbed to her entreaties, and at Whitsun 1759 he arranged for a friend of his, who was visiting Norfolk, to meet Fanny in Swaffham and bring her to join him in East Greenwich. Reunited, the couple vowed that they would never again be parted, and from that point on they passed themselves off as Mr. and Mrs. Kent, and to reinforce their love for one another they even drew up wills, each leaving their money and possessions to the other in the event of their death. Together at last, the couple were blissfully happy, and their happiness increased dramatically when Fanny announced that she was pregnant. Kent now decided that they should move to the City of London, where he would buy a house. But unable to find a suitable property, he opted to take lodgings near the Mansion House. Here he loaned his landlord the sum of £20, and when said landlord refused to repay the money, possibly because he had learned that the couple weren't actually married and had demanded that the loan be written off in exchange for his silence, William Kent had the man arrested for debt. Of course, such a state of affairs made it difficult, if not nigh on impossible, for Mr. and Mrs. Kent to remain as lodgers, and thus they must have thought that fortune had well and truly smiled upon them on that Sunday morning in October 1759, when they met the affable and lodgerless Richard Parsons at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre without Newgate. It wasn't long before the couple had settled into the Parsons household in Cock Lane, where Fanny even had her own servant, an honest and reliable girl by the name of Esther Carlyle, who was generally known as Carrots on account of her shock of bright ginger hair. Soon after moving in, William Kent, who had evidently not learnt from his experience with his previous landlord, lent Richard Parsons the sum of 12 guineas, and it was agreed that it would be repaid at a rate of 1 guinea a month. History, however, had soon repeated itself, and Parsons showed a marked reluctance to keep up the repayments. With animosity brewing between the two men, William Kent had to leave London for a time to attend a wedding in the country, and Miss Fanny, not wishing to sleep alone, asked if the parson's eldest daughter, Elizabeth, could sleep with her. Why Elizabeth was her chosen bedfellow, as opposed to Carrots the servant, is unclear, but nonetheless Mr. and Mrs. Parsons gave their consent. A few mornings later, Fanny came downstairs looking very tired and pale. She complained to Mrs. Parsons that she had been kept awake by the most violent knocking and scratching noises that seemed to emanate from behind the wainscoting of the room. At first, Mrs. Parsons was at a loss to explain the disturbance, but then she remembered that their next-door neighbour was a shoemaker, and declared that he must have been working late into the night. Fanny appears to have accepted this explanation, and for the next few nights she enjoyed undisturbed slumbers. But then, on the Sunday night, the one night when the neighbour would be least expected to work, the noises started up again, so loud this time that Fanny leapt out of bed and called to Mrs. Parsons, "Pray, does your shoemaker work so hard on Sunday nights too?" Mrs. Parsons replied that he most certainly did not, and hurrying to the room, she also heard the mysterious sounds. When William Kent returned, his mistress was on the verge of a breakdown, and concerned for her well-being, as well as for that of their unborn child, he sent for Dr. Thomas Cooper of Northumberland Street, Charing Cross, a physician of great renown. Having examined Fanny, Cooper pronounced her to be in excellent health, and declared that her pregnancy was going well. William Kent now stepped up pressure on Richard Parsons to repay the outstanding arrears on the money he had advanced him, and when Parsons point-blank refused to do so, Kent placed the matter in the hands of his attorney. Given the bad blood between the two men, William Kent deemed that remaining at the Parsons' house was no longer viable, and so in early January 1760 he took the lease of a house in Bartlett's Court, Clerkenwell. But since the property needed quite a lot of work doing on it before it could be considered habitable, the couple, along with Fanny's servant, Carrots, moved into temporary lodgings near to the church of St. John, Clerkenwell, the vicar of which, the Reverend Stephen Aldrich, was an acquaintance of William's. Here Dr. Cooper dropped by several times a week to keep an eye on Fanny, and for a time the pregnancy seemed to be going well. But on the 25th of January, Fanny was suddenly gripped by a severe pain in her back, and believing it to be the onset of labour, she sent for Dr. Cooper. Having examined her, he diagnosed that she was displaying the early signs of an eruptive fever and suggested to William Kent that she should be moved to the couple's new house in Bartlett's Court, which he felt would be more comfortable for her than their cramped temporary lodgings. That afternoon, under the supervision of Dr. Cooper, Fanny, swathed in blankets against the winter cold, was taken by coach to Bartlett's Court, where she was immediately put to bed, and the ever-loyal Carrots agreed to stay on to attend to her. Cooper did all that he could for his patient. He ordered that she be blooded. He prescribed various cordial medicines to draw out the fever. He appointed a nurse to take care of her, and believing that there was little more he could do that day, he returned to Charing Cross, telling Kent that he would be back in the morning. The following day, as promised, Cooper arrived at Bartlett's Court, accompanied by James Jones, an apothecary of Grafton Street, Soho. Fanny's condition had worsened overnight, and the two medical men, having consulted with each other, took William Kent aside and informed him that Miss Fanny was suffering from a very virulent form of smallpox, and warned him to expect the worst. Over the next 4 days, Carrots hardly left her mistress's bedside. Fanny was dosed with cordial medicines, more blood was let, and she received the best medical attention available, so much so that she showed signs of rallying. But then, around the time she was due to give birth, her condition suddenly deteriorated. The pulse flagged, Dr. Cooper later recalled, the fever sank, and the whole eruption put on a warty, pallid appearance. Realizing that her end might well be nigh, Fanny's first thought was to ensure that the will she had drawn up in William Kent's favour was watertight, and so she sent for Mr. Morse, an attorney, who pronounced that the document was sound. She was now finding it difficult to swallow, and her decline became even more pronounced. Dr. Cooper took William Kent aside to inform him that she had but a few days to live. As William Kent readied himself for his coming loss, word of Miss Fanny's impending demise spread around the neighbourhood, and there were some who were openly pronouncing her illness to be God's punishment on her and Kent for living in sin. Over in Cock Lane, the mysterious noises were again being heard at Parsons' house, and James Franzen, the landlord of the Wheatsheaf, dropped by one night to discuss the matter with Richard Parsons. Finding him out, he sat with Mrs. Parsons and the girl Elizabeth in a downstairs room. No sooner had he taken his seat than the noises, sounding, he later recalled, like knuckles knocking against the wainscot, sounded out from sundry locations around the room. Convinced it was a ghost, he rose to head back to his pub, but on opening the kitchen door, he was suddenly startled by something in white, seemingly in a sheet, that shot past him and drifted up the stairs. Repressing his fright, Franzen went to follow, but Elizabeth Parsons quickly shut the door and advised him against it. Terrified by his experience, Franzen hurried home, where he sat shaking by the fire, desperately trying to recover his nerve and too afraid to go to bed. Suddenly, there came a heavy knocking at his door. At first he was too scared to move, but when the knocking came again, he nervously opened the door and found Richard Parsons standing outside. "Give me the largest glass of brandy you have," Parsons stammered. "Why, what's the matter?" the publican inquired. "Oh, Franzen," replied Parsons, "as I was going into my house just now, I saw the ghost." "And so did I," Franzen blurted out, "and have been greatly frightened ever since. Bless me, what can be the meaning? It is very unaccountable." Parsons, though, had an explanation, and as the two men sipped on their brandies, he told Franzen that, as Miss Fanny was still dying, it could not have been her ghost that they had seen, so the only possibility was that it must have been the restless wraith of her sister, William Kent's dead wife, Elizabeth, whose reason for haunting his house might well be to make known her displeasure at the relationship between her husband and her sister. Having planted the seed of suspicion in Franzen's befuddled mind, Parsons downed his brandy and bade him good night. In Bartlett's Court, Miss Fanny was now ailing fast, and since there was nothing more the doctors could do, William Kent sent for his friend, the Reverend Stephen Aldrich, to administer the last rites to his dying lover. Aldrich reassured Fanny that God would forgive her for having taken up with her sister's widower, and he sat praying with her over the final hours of her life. Gradually, her breathing became more and more laboured. Her mind began to wander. She lost the power of speech, and on the evening of Saturday, February the 2nd, she drew her final breath. William Kent now began the melancholy task of arranging her burial. He contacted the local undertaker and asked him to make as good a coffin as he could, both lined and covered. He requested that no name be put on the coffin, probably because he was worried that if he gave her his name, he might leave himself open to prosecution. However, when he went to register the burial, he found that he had no choice but to give her a name, and so he registered it as Frances Kent. He then sent word of her demise to her sister Anne, who was living in Pall Mall. Anne came immediately, and on viewing Fanny's body in her coffin, she was seen by several witnesses to shed copious tears. Kent offered her some of Fanny's clothes, but Anne declined, stating that William Kent was entitled to all her possessions. The funeral service took place at St. John's, Clerkenwell, on the 5th of February, with Stephen Aldrich officiating, and on its conclusion, the coffin was solemnly carried down into the crypt, where Miss Fanny was laid to rest. At least so those present believed. Unbeknownst to them, however, in the world outside, forces were conspiring to make the life of Miss Fanny's bereaved paramour a living hell. William Kent quickly put his loss behind him. He set up as a stockbroker, and by the middle of 1761 he had married again, his new spouse, it was said, possessing a personal fortune of some £3,000. Soon he was negotiating to go into business with his wife's brother, and things were very much looking up for him. But Fanny's family had begun to express their disquiet about the terms of her will, and in October 1761 her brother, John Lyons, began court proceedings against William Kent, claiming that Kent's share of Fanny's estate was rightfully his and his sister Anne's. As William Kent went about rebuilding his life while simultaneously fighting the Lyons family in court, the Parsons household over in Cock Lane was still being troubled by nighttime disturbances. Catherine Friend, the lodger who had taken the room vacated by the Kents, had complained that her repose was being disturbed by the sounds of knocking and scratching coming from behind the wainscoting, and when Parsons could do nothing to stop them, she had moved out. Parsons' daughter Elizabeth, meanwhile, had begun suffering with convulsive fits and was being attended by the apothecary, Mr. Gammon. Throughout 1761, the noises increased in frequency. Determined to get to the bottom of the matter, Richard Parsons called in a carpenter, Bateman Griffiths, and asked him to take down the wainscoting to see if that might reveal the source of the noises. But nothing was found, and the wainscoting was nailed back. The neighbours were now complaining a great deal about the sounds. Parsons told them that he had done everything in his power to find an explanation for them, but his efforts had come to naught. Convinced, or at least so he claimed, that the noises were the work of no human agency, Parsons went to see the Reverend John Moore, who had moved from St. Sepulchre's in June 1761 to become the rector of the Church of St. Bartholomew the Great in Smithfield, again just a stone's throw from Cock Lane. His name and tenure is preserved on the list of past incumbents on the wall in the church's porch. Moore listened intently to what Parsons had to say and told him that the next time the noises were heard, Parsons was to send for him immediately. A few nights later, at 10 o'clock, there came a ferocious knocking on John Moore's door, and opening it, a messenger informed him that he should hurry to Parsons' house without delay. Dressing, he made his way to Pye Corner, turned into Cock Lane, and found an agitated Richard Parsons waiting for him at his front door. Ushering him inside, Parsons led Moore to an upstairs room, from behind the wainscoting of which loud knocking and scratching noises were sounding out, and from that moment on, John Moore would become a major player in the saga of the Cock Lane ghost. Moore had no doubts that the knockings could only be the work of a restless spirit, and he deduced that it must be that of Miss Fanny, and that if she was scratching and knocking so loudly and so regularly, it could only be for one reason. She was trying to impart an important message. That being the case, Moore reasoned, they must devise a means of interpreting the noises in order to find out what exactly it was that Miss Fanny's spirit was so desperate to tell them. The obvious way to converse with the knocking spirit, Moore and Parsons reasoned, was to get it to answer questions by knocking, and so they devised a simple system of communication whereby a single knock would signify yes and two knocks would mean no. Somehow the ghost itself informed them that if it were to become angry or distressed, it would express its displeasure by scratching. It had become apparent that the noises seemed to follow the parson's daughter, Elizabeth. In fact, they were only ever heard wherever and whenever Elizabeth was present, and it was therefore agreed that the child would be the conduit through which communication would be established. And so the stage was set for a supernatural domestic drama that would keep the country enthralled and alarmed in equal measure throughout much of the first 4 months of 1762. At first, the haunting remained a largely localized affair, and only those residing in the vicinity were aware of the paranormal activity. Parsons and Moore began to question the spirit, and they soon discovered that the message that Miss Fanny's spirit was so desperate to impart was a shocking one indeed. It had been assumed that the ghost seen by James Franzen was that of Fanny's dead sister and William Kent's first wife, Elizabeth, and Parsons now conjectured that the reason for her appearance had been to warn that Fanny was about to suffer the same fate as her, that William Kent was planning to murder her as he had done with her sister. With Fanny now dead, just as the ghost had forewarned, the current rappings could only be the work of Miss Fanny, and the reason for her own unrest was more than apparent. She, like her sister, had been murdered by William Kent. Now that they had established a means of communicating with the wraith and had deduced a reason for her knockings, all that remained was to hear the charge from the ghost's own mouth, or, to be precise, from the ghost's own knuckles, in answer to questions put to it by Richard Parsons and John Moore. For some unspecified reason, it was decided that the parson's elderly servant, Mary Fraser, was the one to whom the ghost was most likely to respond, and thus she was chosen to put the questions devised by Moore and Parsons to the spirit. So one night in early January 1762, Elizabeth Parsons was put to bed, and her parents, along with John Moore and Mary Fraser, prepared to make contact with the ghost. "Fanny, Fanny, why don't you come? Do come, pray, Fanny. Come, dear Fanny, come," Mary Fraser intoned. And right on cue, a strange fluttering noise was heard in the room, followed by a series of scratches, and then 2 loud knocks sounded out. Fanny had arrived. Getting down to the business at hand, John Moore asked the spirit if she would respond with a single knock if an injury had been done to any person who had lived in the house, and with 2 knocks if no injury had been done. The question was answered with 1 single knock. Quizzing the invisible entity further, it was established that the ghost was that of a woman, that her name was Fanny, that she and Mr. Kent had lived together in a familiar manner, that 2 years ago she had been taken ill with smallpox, and that during her illness Kent had poisoned her, and that she was buried in St. John's Church in Clerkenwell. There was, it seemed, little doubt that as far as Miss Fanny's spirit was concerned, William Kent had murdered her, and Richard Parsons wasted no time in conveying the shocking revelation to Fanny's family. Anne Lynes was the first of the siblings to meet with the Reverend John Moore, and she told him that when she had gone to view her sister's body, she had been deprived of the pleasure, as the coffin had been screwed down some time before she came to the house. Moore was now convinced that there had been foul play, but given the seriousness of the charge being levelled against William Kent, he decided it would be best to seek the opinion of a fellow clergyman, and he invited the Reverend Thomas Brofton of St. Helens Bishopsgate to visit the house in Cock Lane. This Brofton did on the evening of Tuesday the 5th of January, and sure enough, the mysterious knockings answered any questions put to the spirit, Brofton later testifying that he had been quite unable to detect where in the room the sounds were coming from, and he left the house convinced that the ghost was genuine. It wasn't long before the press found out that the spirit of a murdered woman was being heard at a house in Cock Lane, and in the second week of January the Public Ledger began reporting on the spectral accusations being cast. William Kent, however, remained blissfully unaware of the allegations being levied against him by his deceased paramour. Until, that is, the friend who had escorted Fanny up to London called on him with a copy of the Public Ledger and showed him an account of the bringing of a young lady out of Norfolk to a prison at Greenwich, and told how it was supposed she was murdered by poison which was given her in some pearl. The article both confused and frightened William Kent, and according to a later account, he retired to his chamber to give vent to the passions and commotions in his breast arising from such an accusation. However, he, with the help and advice of his friends, recovered his spirits. A few days later, though, he read in the same newspaper an account of the Cock Lane ghost and of the questions being put to it, and the knowledge that he was supposedly being accused of murder by the ghost of the woman he had loved absolutely terrified him. He decided that the best course of action was to confront the source of the story, and so, taking a witness with him, he called upon the Reverend John Moore and demanded to see the questions that had actually been put to the spirit. Initially, Moore refused his request, but when Kent insisted, the clergyman relented and read the questions to him. When he came to the question asking if the ghost had been married to Kent, Moore paused and asked Kent whether they had in fact been legally married. Kent replied that they had not been, and explained how he had been advised that it would be unlawful for them to marry. Moore then admitted that personally he didn't believe that Kent had murdered Fanny, but since very strange noises of knockings and scratchings were being heard nightly at the house, there must be something exceedingly dark behind them, and if Kent were to visit Parsons' house, he could witness them for himself and be convinced of the ghost's reality. William Kent now had little choice but to attend a séance at the haunted house, and on the night of Tuesday the 12th of January he headed to Cock Lane, accompanied by Dr. Thomas Cooper and the apothecary James Jones, both of whom had attended Fanny in the days before her death. Pushing through the crowd assembled outside, they made their way to the upstairs room, where the by now established ritual of the nightly séances got under way. At her bedtime, Elizabeth Parsons was brought to the room and publicly undressed. Her nightclothes being put on, she and her younger sister were then escorted to the bed, which had been moved to the centre of the room in order that the spectators could sit around it, and as many of them as possible be admitted. Nobody appears to have questioned the morality of any of this. The audience was then warned that the ghost had shown herself to be very sensitive to incredulity and ridicule, so if any of those present were to show any disrespect, then no knockings would be heard. Once the girls were settled, Mary Fraser began her well-honed incantation to summon Fanny's spirit, but the room remained silent. Moore then informed the sitters that they were making too much noise. The ghost, he said, was a sulky, touchy thing, so it might be best if they all went and waited downstairs, and he would try and summon the spirit by stamping with his foot. One by one, the spectators trooped out of the room, descended the dark staircase, and waited. Sure enough, they heard Moore stamping for about 10 minutes, after which he came down and informed them that Fanny had come. Up they all went and stood around the bed, with the knocking noises sounding around the room. Nervously, William Kent asked Moore to put the questions he had read to him at their earlier meeting to the ghost. Moore reminded him that 1 knock meant yes and 2 meant no, and so saying, he began the interrogation. "Are you the wife of Mr. Kent? Did you die naturally? By poison? Did any person other than Mr. Kent administer it? Was it given in water, gruel, beer, or any other liquor?" At this point, a list of beverages was read out, and the spirit knocked once on hearing Pearl announced. "How long did you live after receiving it?" Moore continued. There came 3 knocks, 1 for each hour. "Did Carrots know of you being poisoned? Should Mr. Kent be taken up?" The blood drained from William Kent's face as he heard himself accused of the murder of Fanny Lyons, apparently by her spirit. Someone in the room suddenly called out, "Will Kent be hanged?" and the spirit replied with a loud single knock that echoed around the room. William Kent could take no more. "Thou art a lying spirit," he exclaimed. "Thou art not the ghost of my Fanny. She would never have said any such thing." With that, he stormed from the room, and followed by Dr. Cooper and James Jones, he hurried down the stairs, left the Parsons' house, and headed home to plan how best he could counter the awful damage to his reputation not to mention the threat to his life if perchance the authorities decided that there was any truth in the ghost's accusations. As William Kent fretted over his fate, interest in the ghost increased dramatically, and more people began arriving in Cock Lane to attend the séances and enjoy the spectral performances. The day after William Kent's ordeal, the ghost revealed that she wasn't confined to the house in Cock Lane, but was able to accompany Elizabeth Parsons wherever she went. To test this, on the evening of Thursday the 14th of January, Elizabeth was taken to the house of Mr. Bray and his daughter on Little Britain, where she was put to bed with a servant. Within moments, the knocking noises had begun, and according to Miss Bray, they seemed to be coming from behind the wainscoting and from sundry other places about the room, but most certainly not from the bed where the child lay. Mr. Bray, himself a devout Methodist, took the opportunity to quiz the ghost. "Are you a good spirit?" he asked. "Do you come from God?" By the time Elizabeth was taken back to Cock Lane, Bray and his daughter were convinced that the sounds were supernatural in nature. On Monday the 18th of January, William Kent, accompanied this time by James Jones the apothecary and the Reverend Stephen Aldrich, the vicar of St. John's, Clerkenwell, returned to Cock Lane to attend another séance. When they entered the room, Elizabeth was already in bed, and scratching noises were sounding out. Mary Fraser, who was again acting as the go-between, then piped up, "Are you come, my dear? Pray tell me what it is o'clock." The response was a loud scratching, a sign of the ghost's displeasure. "Do, my dear," Fraser persisted. "Don't be ill-natured. Tell me what it is o'clock." 10 loud knocks were heard. One of the gentlemen who was present then stood up, walked over to the bedside, and proceeded to stamp with his foot. The spirit scratched, the gentleman stamped again, and the spirit scratched. In this fashion, stamping and scratching, the two of them continued for some time before the gentleman grew bored and returned to his seat. Mary Fraser asked if the ghost would answer more questions, to which the spirit concurred with a single knock. "Is Mr. Kent in the room?" intoned Mary Fraser. "Have you been seen by anybody?" "Have you been seen by Mr. Parsons and his daughter and Mr. Franzen?" "Will you show yourself to the persons present?" And so the questioning went on. Had she and William Kent been married? 2 knocks. Had he murdered her? Had he poisoned her? Should he be arrested? Each of which were answered with a single knock. Suddenly a clergyman present took up a candle and, stooping down, looked under the bed. The ghost suddenly went quiet, and Mary Fraser explained that she had disappeared because she didn't like light. 5 minutes later, however, a scratching sound was heard, and Fraser announced that Fanny was back. When asked if she would answer Kent directly, she at first scratched hard and angrily, but on the question being repeated, she knocked once for yes. "Are you my Fanny?" Kent asked. "Can I be of any service to you?" the Reverend Stephen Aldrich inquired. "Can I?" butted in the Reverend Moore. "Can I be of service getting Mr. Kent convicted?" Moore further pressed. The questions now became more and more frivolous, as various people in the room attempted to catch the ghost out, until the responses became just a series of angry scratchings. One important revelation, however, did emerge from this last séance. Fanny was adamant that her servant, Esther Carlyle, the loyal Carrots, would support the assertion that she had been poisoned, and so James Franzen traced her to her latest position, and on Tuesday the 19th of January he brought her to the Reverend John Moore. Carrots, it transpired, had heard nothing of the ghostly goings-on, so John Moore explained that her late mistress was haunting the Parsons' house in Cock Lane, and that her ghost was claiming that she had told Carrots that William Kent had poisoned her shortly before she died. "Bless me, sir," Carrots exclaimed. "My mistress could not speak before she died for 4 days." Unperturbed, Moore arranged for her to attend a séance at the house that night. She arrived early and was further quizzed by Moore in the presence of Mr. and Mrs. Parsons and Mary Fraser. She was told that the house was haunted by the spirit of her mistress, who was claiming that she had been given poison 3 hours before she died, and that she had imparted this to Carrots with her dying breath. Carrots was having none of it. She never told me any such thing. My master and mistress were very loving and lived very happy together. Moore cajoled and threatened her, but Carrots stuck to her guns and was emphatic that her mistress had not told her that she had been poisoned. At about 10 o'clock, William Kent arrived, and that night's participants, numbering some 20 persons, made their way upstairs. The bed was carefully examined, and then the 2 children were brought into the room, undressed, and put to bed. It wasn't long before a scratching noise was heard, and Moore then asked, "Is Carrots in the room?" "Does Carrots know anything of the murder?" "Is your murderer here?" If Carrots and her master were taken up and carried before a magistrate, would they confess? At this point, Carrots insisted on addressing the ghost. "Are you my mistress?" she demanded. There then followed a scratching noise indicating the ghost's displeasure at having her identity questioned. "Are you angry with me, madam?" Carrots continued. "Then I am sure, madam," replied Carrots, "you may be ashamed of yourself, for I never hurt you in my life." And with that, the night's session drew to a close, and the majority of the sitters departed, leaving just Mary Fraser and James Franzen behind. "Do you think the ghost will come again?" Franzen nervously asked Mary Fraser. She replied that it would, and sure enough, within a few moments the noises were heard, and a terrified Franzen timidly inquired of the spirit if he should be frightened to death. The response was one loud, emphatic knock. This so unnerved Franzen that he hurried back to the Wheatsheaf, only to find that the ghost had followed him home, and he and his wife were kept awake by the sound of spectral knocking in their bedroom. The Cock Lane ghost had now become the talk of London, and every night crowds and coaches crammed into the thoroughfare as people of all classes tried to gain admission to the haunted house, or, failing that, to simply stand outside and discuss the supernatural goings-on within. The local pubs and eateries were doing a roaring trade, and James Franzen was more than happy to recount his first-hand experience and knowledge of the hauntings to the increasing clientele that the press reporting of the affair had brought to his pub. On the night of Wednesday the 20th of January, Elizabeth and her sister were moved to the house of Mr. Broun, a pawnbroker at the corner of Hosier Lane and Snow Hill, the adjacent street to the north of Cock Lane. According to the next week's Dublin Courier, once the sitters were assembled and the ghost summoned, several questions as before were again put to it, and answered with knocks and scratchings under the children's bed. Among the attendees at this séance were several gentlemen who, so the Courier reported, were very merry, and who did all in their power to find out the deception, even going so far as to take up part of the flooring, but they found nothing to confirm their suspicions of deceit. As the séance progressed, one of the gentlemen went over and sat by the bed, leaning against it. One of the ghost's advocates asked him to move away, but received short shrift. "Sir," replied the irate spectator, "I came here with the design to know the truth of this affair, and I think I have the right to place myself in any part of the room which I look upon as most suspicious." After further bad-tempered exchanges, Parsons and his companions took umbrage and stormed out of the room. The remaining sitters stayed until midnight, but as no further sounds had been heard for several hours, they decided to call it a night and left. On the way out, one of their number, James Penn, the lecturer from St. Anne's Aldersgate, stopped and asked William Parsons if he would, for the satisfaction of the public, and to put an end to the present distress to his own family, as well as that of Mr. Kent, consent for the removal of his daughter to the house of the Reverend Aldrich in Clerkenwell. Parsons replied that he would willingly consent, and when the same request was put to his daughter, she too agreed without hesitation. The next day, Aldrich and Penn arrived at Parsons' abode and outlined their plans to Richard. Elizabeth, they said, would be taken to Aldrich's house and placed in a bed standing by itself in the middle of a large empty room. No one associated with the haunting thus far was to be allowed to be present, not even her father. She would be thoroughly examined in the presence of some clergy, a physician, a surgeon, an apothecary, and a justice of the peace. Other gentlemen of impeccable credentials would also be invited to attend. Parsons offered no objections to any of these conditions, and it was agreed that the trial would take place the next night, Friday the 22nd of January. All was now in place to prove once and for all whether the ghost was genuine or not, and on the Friday morning James Penn arrived at the Parsons' house along with the gentleman of veracity and fortune and his sister to finalise the arrangements for the coming night's séance. They were met by a very ill-tempered Richard Parsons, who demanded to know what they wanted. "Is the child here?" Penn asked. "No," snapped Parsons. "Where is she?" Penn persisted. "I shall not tell you," Parsons growled back. "She shall go nowhere, nor be seen any more." Penn asked if he had not given his consent for the child to be taken to Aldrich's house. "No matter for that," Parsons shot back. "She shall go nowhere." And so saying, he slammed the door shut. Elizabeth had in fact been taken to the matron's lodgings at St. Bartholomew's Hospital across the road from the eastern end of Cock Lane. Here another séance had been planned, but when by midnight the ghost had failed to perform, the assembled spectators consoled themselves by tucking into the dried beef and downing copious amounts of the sound port that had been laid on for their delectation. Several of them were so enthusiastic in their consumption of the latter that they became extremely unruly and had to be physically ejected from the premises. Those who remained had to wait till 6 a.m. before 3 scratches, sounding like a cat's claws drawn across a cane chair, were heard. Elizabeth seemed to be fast asleep, and one member of the group began discussing loudly that he was convinced that the whole thing was a fraud. No sooner had the words left his lips than Elizabeth began crying loudly. Asked what was the matter, she sobbed that she was afraid of what would become of her father, who would be ruined and undone if this was thought to be a fraud. "But I thought you were sound asleep when I mentioned it to be a fraud," the gentleman who had made the allegations quizzed. "Aye, but not so sound that I could not hear all you said," the child tearfully replied. With the public interest in the ghost now reaching fever pitch, and with the two camps, those who believed that the ghost was real and those who did not, unable to reach any agreement, it was decided that an approach should be made to Sir Samuel Fludyer, the Lord Mayor, who as Chief Magistrate for the City of London had ultimate authority in the city. Fludyer agreed to hear the case the following Saturday, January the 23rd. That day, John Moore and Richard Parsons appeared before the Lord Mayor, told him of their experiences, and hoped that if the ghost's claims were true and William Kent had indeed poisoned Fanny, justice would be done. Fludyer listened intently to what they had to say, and then told them that he would not issue a warrant for William Kent's arrest. Neither, when approached by William Kent and Stephen Aldrich that same day, would he issue a warrant for fraud against Richard Parsons. Instead, he ordered that the girl was to be taken to Stephen Aldrich's house as previously agreed, where the proposed investigation was to be undertaken. The two sides were now openly attacking each other in the newspapers. Aldrich published an account of the difficult dealings with Parsons thus far. Parsons responded by issuing a riposte against Aldrich's accusations. But thanks to the Lord Mayor's intervention, Richard Parsons now had little choice but to submit his daughter for the proposed investigation at Aldrich's house. There was to be an additional supernatural dimension to this particular investigation, in that at a previous séance the ghost had intimated that if William Kent and several other gentlemen were to descend into the crypt of St. John's, Fanny would provide absolute proof of her existence by knocking from inside Francis Lyne's coffin. Stephen Aldrich duly sent word to Parsons and John Moore, informing them that he was going to hold the ghost to that promise. Between 8 and 9 p.m. on the evening of Monday the 1st of February, the Committee of Gentlemen, as the press had dubbed them, began arriving at Aldrich's house, to which Elizabeth had already been taken, and where she had been prepared for bed by 2 women. The most prominent member of the committee was Dr. Samuel Johnson, still basking in the glow of having published his definitive and well-received A Dictionary of the English Language. Johnson desperately wanted to believe in the supernatural, and although it is evident that he entertained grave doubts about the spirit's existence, he was nonetheless open to being persuaded otherwise. According to Johnson's later account of the proceedings, the investigators headed upstairs at 10 p.m. They sat with the girl for about an hour, but as nothing had happened, they went downstairs and interrogated Richard Parsons, who assured them in the strongest possible terms that no fraud was involved. As they were quizzing Parsons, two ladies who had been left with the girl came down and informed them that they had heard knocks and scratches. When the gentleman went up to the room, the girl informed them that she felt the spirit like a mouse on her back. The girl was told to put her hands outside the covers, which she did, and thereafter no further noises were heard. After a while, it was announced that the ghost would be required to make good on her promise to knock from inside Miss Fanny's coffin, and the gentlemen duly headed round to St. John's Church, where John Moore and another descended into the dank, dark crypt. Their call for the spirit to fulfil its promise was met with stony silence, and they headed back up to the body of the church. William Kent and several others then went down into the crypt, but again no knocking was heard. Returning to Aldrich's house, they questioned the girl, but were unable to extract a confession of fraud, and at between 2 and 3 in the morning they allowed her father to take her back to Cock Lane. It is therefore the opinion of the whole assembly, Johnson's report concluded, that the child has some art of making or counterfeiting particular noises, and that there is no agency of any higher cause. John Moore was so downcast at the ghost's failure to knock on the coffin that he told William Kent that he now believed it to be a fraud. He even offered to assist in proving it to be so, but when Kent asked him to swear an affidavit testifying to what he knew about the matter, he backpedaled and said that although he believed Kent to be innocent of having played any part in Miss Fanny's death, he was still convinced that the ghost was genuine, and opined that the visitation was evidently a judgment on Kent for having lived in sin with Miss Fanny. The child Elizabeth was now being moved between various houses to see if the ghost would indeed follow her wherever she went. On Wednesday the 3rd of February, a séance was held at a house in Cow Lane, at which the sitters were astonished when a loose curtain ring suddenly began spinning furiously, apparently of its own accord, on its rod. Later that day, as Elizabeth was turning a piece of meat on the spit back at her house in Cock Lane, such violent knocking sounded out from behind the wainscoting above the chimney that those present were afraid it would break the chimney to pieces. That night, when Elizabeth was put to bed at her house and another séance got under way, one of the attendees asked why she, the ghost, had not made good on her promise to knock from inside the coffin. A number of possible explanations were then read out, and according to a newspaper account, the ghost responded with one knock to "not there" because the coffin had been taken away. Parsons was clearly beginning to realise the seriousness of his position if he could not prove the ghost's existence, and so on Sunday the 7th of February he agreed to another investigation, this time at the home of a gentleman near the Strand, where his daughter was put to bed in the same room as the gentleman and his wife. Nothing happened on the Sunday night, but on the following night, as it got towards dawn, scratching and knocking noises began to be heard. The husband immediately rang for a servant and asked them to fetch a light, and going to the bed in which Elizabeth was sleeping, he found she was fast asleep and quite still. But as he stood looking at her, he heard an unaccountable whispering. "What are you whispering about?" his wife demanded. "We're not," replied the husband. "It's something else. I'm trying to understand what is being said." Although unable to ascertain exactly what was being whispered, he, his wife and their servant were adamant that they had all heard it and that the child's lips had not moved. More noises were heard over the course of the next few nights, and on the Wednesday night they became so violent that the terrified householders asked that the child be removed from their house. The noises, however, continued for several nights after her departure. On Sunday the 14th of February, Elizabeth was taken to the house of a Mr. Miziter near Covent Garden. That night a maid slept with her and lay with her legs over the girl's, whilst simultaneously holding Elizabeth's hands firmly. But the knockings were soon sounding out. The next night a bed was placed at the centre of another room in the house, and Miziter and a friend slept in the same room. Once again the noises were heard, and the ghost even replied with its customary 1 or 2 knocks to questions put to it by Miziter and his friend. The following night Elizabeth's hands and legs were tied, although she did manage to slip one hand out of its restraint, and the noises were heard. Over the next 2 nights she slept in a hammock, again with her arms and legs tied firmly. there were no noises. On the night of Sunday the 21st of February, before being put to bed, Elizabeth was told that unless the ghost was heard, she and her parents might well be sent to the dreaded Newgate prison. Missiter had instructed 2 of his servants to keep a constant watch on the girl through a peephole in the wall, and that night, when Elizabeth was left alone in the room, they saw her get out of bed, take a small piece of board from the fireside, and secrete it about her person. Sure enough, when the séance got underway that night, knocking noises were heard, whereupon the girl was challenged over the deceit. She strenuously denied having anything concealed about her person, but on her being searched, the board was found, and the game was all but up. However, the rumour that the reason Fanny's ghost had not knocked from inside her coffin was because the coffin had actually been removed from the crypt of St. John's was still rife throughout London, and William Kent decided that there was only one way to scotch it. Thus, on Thursday the 25th of February, he, Stephen Aldrich, the parish clerk, and the undertaker descended into the vault beneath St. John's Church, where the undertaker identified Miss Fanny's coffin, which was the only one without a plate or an inscription. There was, of course, only one way to remove any lingering doubts, and so the undertaker unscrewed the lid of the coffin and lifted it. According to his later account, the coffin certainly contained Miss Fanny's remains, although it was an awful and shocking sight. News of this was quickly made public, and over at the Church of St. Bartholomew the Great, the Reverend John Moore realised that the full force of William Kent's retribution was about to come down upon him. So later that day he issued a public retraction, avowing that Kent's reputation had been attacked in a most gross and unjustified manner by the pretended ghost in Cock Lane, and certifying that the accusatory knockings and scratchings were the effects of some artful, wicked contrivance. There was, he stated, not the least ground for suspicion against William Kent, who had preserved that becoming steadfastness which nothing but innocence could inspire. William Kent had now been fully vindicated by one of his main accusers, as well as in the court of public opinion, and now all that remained was for him to seek legal redress. Richard Parsons, his wife, the Reverend John Moore, Mary Fraser, and Richard James, the man responsible for many of the newspaper reports accusing Kent of murder, were all arrested and charged with conspiring to injure the character of William Kent, and that they did conspire to take away his life by charging him with the murder of Fanny Lines by giving her poison whereof she died. Their trial began on Saturday, July the 10th at the City of London's Guildhall, with Lord Mansfield presiding. The court was packed. The first to testify was William Kent, who gave details of his marriages to both Lines sisters, of his intimacy with Fanny, and of her death. James Franzen gave an account of his terrifying encounter with the ghost. He was followed by Esther Carrots Carlyle, who told of her mistress's final hours. Dr. Cooper recalled Fanny's illness and demise, and told the court that from the outset he had believed the scratchings and knockings to be a trick. The defence called a number of witnesses who all testified to the good character of the defendants, and several of them were adamant that the ghost had been real. The trial lasted the whole day and on into the night. There was a terrifying moment in the proceedings when an uncommon and violent noise suddenly sounded out from an adjoining room. According to the Coventry Standard, this greatly terrified some of the common people, and it was plain from their faces that they believed that the ghost was about to appear in court. However, it transpired that the disturbance was caused by a gentleman who had managed to get trapped on the roof of the building, and in trying to get down had caused one of the windows to break and fall in. Once all the witnesses had given evidence, Lord Mansfield summed up, and the jurors retired to consider their verdict. At 9:30 that night, having deliberated for just 15 minutes, they returned and gave a verdict of guilty against all the defendants. However, sentencing was deferred until later that year, and the defendants were allowed to return to their homes. Their next court appearance was on the 22nd of November, when sentencing was again deferred in order that they could agree on the level of damages that they would pay to William Kent. but by January 1763 they still had not made a reasonable offer, and on the 27th of that month they were brought to court again and were this time committed to the King's Bench prison to await sentencing. John Moore and Richard James now agreed to pay Kent £588, and having been reprimanded by the judge, they were released. On February the 12th, the other defendants were brought into court and sentencing began. Richard Parsons was given 2 years' imprisonment and was ordered to stand 3 times in the pillory. His wife was sentenced to 1 year, and Mary Fraser was given 6 months in Bridewell. Parsons, though, did not go quietly, and he was led from the court, loudly protesting his innocence. His first stint in the pillory was meant to be at the end of February, but since he was, according to the Ipswich Journal, disordered in his mind, the punishment was deferred for a few weeks. On the 16th of March it was announced that he would be pilloried that day, and a crowd duly assembled at the Snow Hill end of Cock Lane to watch Parsons be led to the pillory. The mob, however, took pity on him, and far from being subjected to the traditional pelting with rotten vegetables, dead dogs and putrefying cats, which was the normal barrage a detainee in the pillory could expect to receive, the spectators had a whip round and raised the handsome sum of 10 guineas for him. On Thursday the 30th of March he stood in the pillory again, this time at the Royal Exchange, and once again the crowd showed him extraordinary leniency, with several spectators giving him money. His final pillorying was at Charing Cross on Friday the 8th of April, when, according to the Coventry Standard, there was a prodigious number of spectators who seemed to commiserate his case, and a collection was made for him as at the 2 former times. And thereafter all the players in the drama of the Cock Lane ghost shuffled away and faded into obscurity. We know that John Moore died in 1768. Elizabeth Parsons is said to have died at Chiswick in 1805, having been married twice. But as for Richard Parsons, William Kent, Mrs. Parsons, Esther Carlyle, and Mary Fraser, we know nothing of what became of them. Of course, such was the allure of the ghost that it began featuring prominently in the entertainments of the age. Pamphlets and ballads about it were appearing almost as soon as Fanny had been exposed, and plays about it were staged at several London theatres. Artist and satirist William Hogarth featured it in his print Credulity, Superstition and Fanaticism, a medley, published at the end of April 1762. On the right of the print, beneath the pulpit, a clergyman can be seen pushing an icon of the Cock Lane ghost down the front of the dress of a young lady who is wrapped with religious ecstasy, whilst a thermometer to their right features an upper panel showing a depiction of the child, Elizabeth, in her bed in the haunted room in Cock Lane, with the ghost floating beside her. There can be no doubt about it, Fanny's ghost had certainly captured the public imagination, and references to the haunting would continue to crop up in novels, newspapers and plays for many years to come. Today, Cock Lane bears no resemblance to how it would have looked in the 18th century, albeit the Golden Boy still keeps a watchful eye from his lofty perch on the toings and froings below, just as he did on the ebb and flow of the crowds who came here in search of the ghost in 1762. The houses that lined the street then were torn down long ago, and the walls that formed the backdrop for the spectral drama have been reduced to rubble and splintered timbers that may or may not lie beneath the offices that now occupy their sites. The only knockings you are likely to hear today come from couriers making deliveries, whilst the only crowds you are likely to encounter are those participating in ghost walks and history tours for whom this nondescript backwater is still an important stop. Yet the legend of the ghost that captivated a nation refuses to die and remains etched into the dark corners of London's history. It serves as a chilling reminder that the line between fact and fiction can sometimes become blurred, and when it does, well, as Charles Mackay put it in Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions, but thus it always is. If 2 or 3 persons can only be found to take the lead in any absurdity, however great, there is sure to be plenty of imitators. Like sheep in a field, if one clears the stile, the rest will follow. And so we cast a final glance along Cock Lane and turn our backs on a tale that is both intriguing and fascinating, shining as it does a light on an unimportant thoroughfare that for a brief period in the 18th century became the talk of the country. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please be sure to give it a like and subscribe to my channel. It really does make a difference. I'd love to know your opinions on this thought-provoking case. What do you think was the motivation behind Parsons and Moore's vendetta against William Kent? Do you think that Elizabeth Parsons was a willing participant in the hoax? Let me know in the comments section below. I really do value and enjoy your input. Until we meet again in the twilight world of the paranormal, dear viewer, stay safe. And when you get to bed tonight, do have very sweet and pleasant dreams.